Hey guys, it's Liv here, and in today's discussion video, we're going to live in a world for about 15-20 minutes where we pretend that Landorus Therian, as well as every other top tier mon in OU, is completely banned from the metagame, and we're going to see what changes. If you enjoy this type of content and you want to see more, leave a like down below and subscribe for more content like this. I'll be honest, as of the time of recording this video, it's about 5 days before this goes up, so I don't even know what next week's question is going to be, but if you click the link in the description, you'll see what the comment question of the week is for next week's discussion video, so make sure you click that and answer the comment question in the video in some way, shape, or form. I'll be honest, I don't even know what realm it's going to be in. But leave a like and subscribe for more, comment your thoughts on the video, and with that said, let's get into it. So we're going to be breaking this video into two different parts. The first is what if Landorus was banned in the Gallardex metagame, and the second will be what if Landorus was banned in the Natdex OU metagame. So I decided to take some suggestions of Pokemon that you guys suggested on Twitter, as well as in the comments of other videos, or any sort of realm of that sort, and we're going to go over why they might be good or bad. I did break them into what I personally felt was like the top 5 Pokemon, and I threw in some of my own thoughts as well on this, just because I did get a lot of the same couple of Pokemon, and I'll actually get into that as we get into the video, for what specifically people thought would be the best Pokemon in the metagame. So with that said, with Gallardex, there were 5 different Pokemon that were going to get banned with this list. So with Landorus's ban comes a few other Pokemon, being Heatran, Weavile, Dragapult, and Melmetal. Those 5 Pokemon were all banned. What ends up being the top tier Pokemon? So in order 1 to 5, I think the best Pokemon will probably end up being Garchomp, followed by FERROTHORN, TAPU LELE, TAPU Koko, and Landorus Therian. So Garchomp was probably, of any Pokemon suggested in the list, the most commonly suggested for the best Pokemon, whether people were talking about Gallardex or National Dex, and for good reason too. Typically, Garchomp is seen as one of the better ground types in any competitive setting, whether it's singles, doubles, past gen, current gen. Garchomp is always one of those Pokemon that will always be lingering in some way, shape, or form. At the current moment, it seems like a lot of the people who did respond to this tweet in particular felt that Garchomp was going to be one of, if not the best Pokemon. They had figured it could take on Landorus's roles both in an offensive and defensive sense, and while they would probably mostly be leaning towards Garchomp becoming an absolutely powerful offensive menace, it could still definitely take on some roles with stuff like Tank Chomp sets that could be utilized in more defensive means as defensive rockers, or just meant to toxic typical Garchomp checks like Zapdos, and honestly, I couldn't agree more. As far as FERROTHORN goes, obviously with Heatran out of the metagame, as well as also clearing a couple Pokemon that FERROTHORN would typically have to opt into, physically speaking, being Weavile and Melmetal, you could actually probably see a lot more Spadef FERROTHORN going around, because now FERROTHORN is going to be the best check in the format to Tapu Lele, which ends up being our 3rd Pokemon. With both AV Melmetal as well as Heatran out of the picture, and even offensive counterplay with stuff like Dragapult that would typically be able to revenge off choice spec sets instead of worrying about choice Scarf Lele or needing to run it to outpace Dragapult, Lele's having a pretty good time in this format. Honestly, I think Lele, while it would probably be more viable than FERROTHORN, I think that FERROTHORN, and these are actually going to be sorted by my personal opinions on usage, not by viability. I do have to point that out there. I think Lele will be used less than FERROTHORN, but that's because I think more teams will need FERROTHORN to check Tapu Lele and Tapu Koko. Which, speaking of, for Lele, I do think that most of its sets would probably be Choice Scarf. However, Choice Specs could be pretty viable. I'll get into the specific sets though in a bit. For Koko I think would be 4th. A lot of people thought that Koko could be a pretty decent offensive response to Garchomp. I couldn't agree more. Still a really great pivot. Now that Dragapult and Weavile are gone, this is like the premier fast Pokemon in the metagame, especially when losing one of its better counterplay options being Landorus. And while stuff like FERROTHORN could be a potential soft check, again, why I also think that FERROTHORN will become a more Spadef Pokemon, Koko's still pretty good at revenging some Pokemon like Garchomp if it's not Scarfed, stuff like Torn, so I think that Koko will be pretty good. I do agree with the people who did suggest that. And the final mon suggested was Torn-T. This was actually the one very original idea, actually, was Zeke mentioning that Torn-T would probably get a lot better. Koko was the suggestion by Bennett Bandit, and then again, pretty much every answer mentioned Chomp. But Zeke had mentioned Torn-T and just general regen getting a lot better, and I think it makes a lot of sense. I mean, regen's always a great thing, to be honest. I don't think it really hurt, but one thing I will say is that Torn does have a lot more versatility without having to worry about stuff like Heatran and Melmetal switching on it, as well as stuff like Weavile revenging it. So I do think these would be the top 5 usage Pokemon. Now let's get into each one a little bit more on a personal basis. So first up though, we do have the new GARCHOMP. Now GARCHOMP probably wouldn't really change a lot. However, one thing I will mention is that GARCHOMP just gets better. Without having to worry about stuff like Weavile to revenge it off with Ice Shard, you don't have to worry about stuff like Dragapult revenging it off pre-Scale Shot. And on top of that, you don't have to worry about Landorus switching in and intimidating you and just going for a knockoff Earthquake or Toxic. This does already make Garchomp a lot more potent, and truthfully, I could actually see a world where Garchomp gets banned. There would be some actual soft checks to this, to be fair, but just like how I feel about Garchomp and BDSP, it would be an absolutely menacing Pokemon for this format. Your checks would basically revolve around stuff like Corviknight, which risks Fire Fang and doesn't do a lot back anyway. It would be Pokemon like Rillaboom that would mostly be there to try and limit Earthquake, as well as Tapu Bulu for the same reason. But again, both do fear taking Fire Fang, and they still have to worry about stuff like Rough Skin damage. You'd have Pokemon like Zapdos, which this could always adapt Fire Fang or even Scale Shot, or really any move in the set, for a Rock move for it. So nothing's really safe as far as that realm goes. While there are Pokemon that could take out any particular set, there's a lot of Pokemon that could still in general handle Garchomp. And in tandem with Zapdos, this could honestly probably handle any viable check to Garchomp now, since one of the biggest means that can mutually handle them, being Weavile, is no longer in the picture. As far as the format goes, I actually can't really think of a viable check that could handle both Pokemon. The best one I'm thinking would be offensive Hail Cores with stuff like A9 plus Arctozolt, but even still, it's definitely a step down from Weavile, which doesn't need Weather to actually revenge the core. So I do think Garchomp would be an absolute menace. I don't know if it would personally be banned. I'd get it if it happened though. I think that I could totally see it happening in OU, but I think Garchomp would truthfully just fill all of Landorus' roles in a pretty near perfect degree. It could be a nice Scarfer, it could be a good Helmet Mon, or just general defensive piece. It could be a good setup Mon. It could do a lot of them. Next up though, we do a FERROTHORN. Now FERROTHORN would definitely have to adopt the CHOPLE Berry sets, and while I think a FERROTHORN could also adopt more Spidef variants, I think that realistically it would still definitely benefit from having a physical defense for stuff like Kartana. I think that CHOPLE Berry would be pretty mandatory though, because actually even if you go with max Spidef, LELE can still actually roll you with Specs Focus Blast, even with Stealth Rocks up, let alone with Spikes, which other FERROTHORN could easily just set for your own FERROTHORN. So I do think a FERROTHORN would definitely be in a bit of a pickle this generation, especially without Landorus being around just as a general presence, and without stuff like Heatran and Melmetal being around to actually wall LELE. I do think that that would put a lot more pressure on FERROTHORN now to pick up the slack. LELE would probably be, if I had to pick any Pokemon on this list, actually the first one I would say that gets suspected. I think it would go to LELE, then Chomp, and I don't know if the rest would get suspected, but if anything else, maybe Coco. Torrentee might, just because it's regen mon. I don't think FERROTHORN will get tested at all though, unless they really just went gung-ho banning any sort of walls. But I think that really, if any of these 5 have to get banned first, it would be LELE. So I do think FERROTHORN will sadly have to pick up the slack, because stuff like Corviknight, for example, as well as Skarmory risks Steeble, which is not great, and truthfully, LELE could also just ditch a Psychic move for Thunderbolt for those Pokemon anyway. But FERROTHORN really does kind of have to just hope for the Focus Blast mist and make sure that it can somehow take the hit. As I said, those Spidef variants could take over. I think Physical could still be not bad. It requires a CHOPLE Berry though, basically, because it needs to pick up the LELE checking. Next up though, we do have Tapu Lele. Now, while I do think that Specs Lele would be an absolute monster, I actually think that Scarf would be slightly more viable, specifically because it would need to now be checking Garchomp offensively as well, which will be an absolute monster in the tier. So I think that Scarf Lele with Future Sight, Psyshock, Moonblast, and Focus Blast would be the premier set, though obviously any team would have to make sure that it has checks for both Scarf and Specs Lele, because if you prepare for only one of them, you're going to get massacred by the other, because Lele is just that fucking broken as a Pokemon. So Psychic Surge Lele would probably be one of the best Pokemon of the tier in my personal opinion. It's already an amazing Pokemon. I just think that without, Heatran or Melmetal, this is probably just one of the best Pokemon flat out, because Heatran and Melmetal were typically some of the better Fairy Switches you could really get, and while FERROTHORN is still a good one, it's definitely not in the same vein, considering Heatran was at least a 4x Fairy Resist, and Melmetal was able to absolutely shatter a lot of teams and put pressure and force teams to sack Lele a lot more difficult, or a lot more easily, I should say. So I do think that while Lele still definitely could have muscled both, it's in a lot better of a position now, only needing to worry about FERROTHORN basically. It's really the only steal that it actually has to care about, because everything else it can definitely pressure significantly more easily long term. Next up we have Coco. Coco's set I don't actually think will change at all. It's honestly been amazing as a Boots Pivot this gen, and it still does have a lot of Pokemon this does benefit running a Boots Pivot set for. Stuff like Torrentee, Corviknight, Garchomp, all really do still have to worry about Boots Pivot, in my opinion, and especially not having to risk worrying about webs is a pretty decent thing, as well as just hazard stacking, keeping Koko as healthy as possible to outpace non-Scarf variants of those Pokemon. So I do think that Koko honestly just keeps a standard set. Nothing really to change here, though I will say not having to worry about Landorus, Dragapult, well, not worry about Landorus, Heatran, or Melmetal, you could honestly get away with Specs pretty easily. Specs would really only have to worry about as far as electric moves go, stuff like Garchomp, and maybe if we're looking at more defensive grounds, probably like a Hippowdon, though truthfully, I do think that Garchomp would probably just take the reins. Hippowdon, I will say though, would have a lot more usage as far as being a Garchomp check goes, which is another thing I think would rise a lot actually in usage, because it would basically be the best check you'd have to Garchomp as far as a long-term check. So maybe Koko wouldn't run Specs because of that, because to be fair, Hippowdon would be a fucking amazing switch into Garchomp, as well as Koko, as long as it's not going for Knot. Though if you did go with Specs, it would probably ditch like Roost from Grass Knot just to try and pressure Hippo. Assuming that Hippo's usage again did go up, which I think could be a solid consequence of Garchomp being the best ground of the tier now, since at the very least with other Landorus, they do check each other, and with Garchomp, Landorus checks it pretty well. Without Landorus, I think Hippo would probably surge a bit. So Koko would still probably not necessarily get to run Specs as freely, but not having to worry about 2 of the 3 best steals at the very least is pretty promising as far as Gleam spam goes. So we might actually see Specs variants. I'm kind of unsure on that one, jury's still out, but I think at least Boots would still be a pretty amazing set, and at least as good if not slightly better than Specs, because Boots is still amazing on Koko. Finally though, we do have the Torn. Torn again probably wouldn't change that much in all honesty. It does benefit a bit though, not having to worry about 2 of its best Hurricane switch-ins being Melmetal and Heatran, as well as not needing to worry about Weavile trying to revenge it off, and just generally making the team a lot more liable to being revenged off by Triple Axel. So I do think that Torn would spike a bit in usage. As far as Pokemon that Torn would be really good with, I think it would be amazing with Garchomp. However, truthfully, I think that Torn's best partner on the team would probably be LELE, trying to clear any sort of webs for Specs or Scarf sets, that way then it could just break really easily. It would still be an amazing option to handle any sort of FERROTHORN, whether it was hazard stacking or just going for like a taunt to try and stop FERROTHORN from stacking hazards. Torn would honestly be an amazing partner for LELE teams in my opinion, and I think the tandem of the two would be so monstrous for OU. As far as Pokemon I think go down in usage, I didn't make a slide for these actually, but I think really the only thing that actually takes a huge spike down in usage would probably be Buzzwole. Buzzwole is really mostly ran for Weavile checking in all honesty, and I think everything else has its some sort of presence to where it's not exactly ruined by stuff like Lando, Heatran, etc. being out of the meta. Maybe I guess Bisharp if anything, but Bisharp somehow is the second most mon affected, I think. And even still, I think Bisharp is a decent presence, taking over as a solid offensive dark type if anything else. Regardless, so I do think that as far as Galar deck setting, these would be the top 5 Pokemon, but let's get into the National deck setting, because I do think this one's actually a bit more interesting. Lando has a lot more of a presence in Nat as a much more well-rounded Pokemon. Typically, we've seen a lot more bulkier Landos enter the Galar deck's presence. However, as far as Nat goes, Lando does have one big thing going for it, being Z moves. As far as the ban list for this set goes, the new banned Pokemon are Heatran, Landorus Therian, Weavile, and Megalop, though I will say that stuff like Tornadus Therian and Dragapult just already had hard Nat Dex OU bans, so these Pokemon will not be included in the rankings. However, for our top 5 best Pokemon as far as Nat Dex, in my personal opinion, or most used I should say, I think we'll go GLISCOR, Garchomp, FERROTHORN, Ashgren, and TOXAPEX. Now, I do have to mention that while I think a Garchomp will be the best Pokemon in the format on this list, I think that GLISCOR will have more usage. Now, as far as why this tier list ends up being how it is, I do think there are a few things to note. One, there are a few honorable mentions with this that honestly, there were too many good Pokemon for not to mention. I would have probably been able to do a top 10 list and still not have mentioned enough things that get better with these bans. Stuff like, for example, LELE would become a monster even still. However, it does now still need to worry about Melmetal as well as FERROTHORN, so it's another Sealed giving it competition. Also a lot of stuff like Mega Scizor, and while LELE gets it in Power Fire in that dex, I don't think it would be enough personally. On top of this as well, if we were to, let's say, open up other Pokemon that we discussed, like Koko, for example. Koko now needs to worry about 2 of the best ground types in the format, being GLISCOR and Landorus, and I think similar to how they're some of the best Pokemon in BDSP, they'd still be some of the best Pokemon in that dex. If we were to look at other Pokemon that ended up being top tier in Galar, Tornti, again, was banned. I still think FERROTHORN would be amazing in this format. If anything, I think it would be better in this format, but I'll get into that in a bit. And I still think a Garchomp would be amazing. So as far as why I think this would be the usage set, let's first start off with GLISCOR. GLISCOR, I think, would typically adopt a lot more of Landorus' more defensive roles, and we actually do see a lot of teams, sample teams in general, already running GLISCOR, actually. While it's not to the degree that Lando was running them, at the very least, GLISCOR still definitely does have, at the very least, if nothing else, a solid national dex presence already carved out on a lot more balanced builds specifically. If we were to pull up sample teams from NatDexOU, there are a few things that GLISCOR already does run a lot, especially with Pokemon like Pex and FERROTHORN, as well as Megalodi. You can typically see GLISCOR running a lot more of those sort of balances. And again, while Landorus typically is a lot more splashable, I think that GLISCOR still definitely at least has its own presence in the tier, if nothing else, on the more defensive stall builds. Especially with Pokemon like Pex, I think that's really the big partner with it. And especially with a tier where FERROTHORN would still be one of the better Pokemon for similar reasons of not having to worry about stuff like Heatran and being one of the better steals to check LELE at this point. I think that GLISCOR, FERROTHORN, Pex specifically would be such an amazing core that's why I think Pex also enters this tier list. I think by GLISCOR being one of the top mons, Pex becomes so much more viable because it's an amazing partner already with GLISCOR. Pex, to be fair, was an honorable mention for Galar if I had to pick one, but I think that just considering the mons that are still left over in Nat versus Galar, I think that Pex ends up actually joining the fray. It's already a mod that's actually been suspect tested in OU for NatDex, just because it's an amazing Z counter, because you could just regen off the Z hits. You're able to, in general, just take advantage of regen a lot more freely in this tier. This is an amazing check to a lot of Pokemon with stuff like Helmet, or just general T-Spikes, which are amazing in NatDex. Just a general much more vital wall to the tier in my personal opinion, and while it would lose a bit of a presence having to no longer deal with stuff like Weavile and Megalopony, you would still definitely have enough physical attackers in the tier that Pex would be valuable against, or even Pokemon like Ashgren that this can sponge a hit from pretty freely. So I don't think it would necessarily become unviable. Now, speaking of Ashgren, that is the last Pokemon I do have to cover here. Ashgren, I think, would be another reason actually for FERROTHORN Surgeons, because similar to how FERROTHORN surged to counter LELE in Galar decks, I think FERROTHORN would now be also considered one of the better responses to Ashgren. Now, FERROTHORN was already considered one of the best, but losing out on a huge offensive response in Megalopony is a pretty big detriment. Ashgren now loses out on like the best Pokemon that actually outpaces it, barring Scarfers. So because of that, FERROTHORN now would pretty much need to be a huge defensive piece in tandem with TOXAPEX to actually sponge Ash Greninja hits. So that's why I said that before, that GLISCOR, FERROTHORN, and Pex I think would be a really insanely used defensive core, because I think the three of them in tandem would be able to check GARCHOMP and Ashgren so well, as well as a lot of the other Pokemon that just barely missed out on the list, like Coco, Lele, etc., that I had mentioned in my Galar portion, that I think these three would actually become a pretty standard core in OU, like literally the like bread and butter defensive core of OU teams. If they're not running HO, I think they'd quite literally all be running that core. As far as teams go, GLISCOR, I think would, as I said, adopt Landorus' more defensive roles with stuff like Toxic, Roost, Stealth Rock, and Earthquake. Obviously, GLISCOR could take a lot of the pressure in general roles from Landorus, whether it's offensive, defensive, etc. However, I do think that GLISCOR would slightly lean more towards the defensive roles, just because of Poison Heal being such a good ability. Now, I will say that this is pretty much a standard spread already for GLISCOR. However, I did take out some of the speed. GLISCOR typically would have run a lot more of a fast set. However, with 60 speed, you actually do outpace Magnezone, which is now really the only thing you actually need to creep at GLISCOR these days, because Heatran is no longer in the picture. So the rest is just thrown into Spadef, because the Fizdef was really just for stuff like Sucker Punch and Play Rough Mega Mawile, so you no longer actually need to invest in anything else. You could throw this into Spadef to better check stuff like Coca. Next up would be Garchomp, which I think would run Rocky MZ slightly over Dragonium, though to be fair, Dragonium would still be amazing. You've now cleared out one of the better versus Speak Heatran, though Heatran is not a Garchomp switching by any sense, it's just a better Dragon Resist. You would still have to worry about a lot of good steals and fairies though, stuff like Clefable, Corviknight, and FERROTHORN would be a few to mention. So I don't think a Dragonium would be necessarily like the best set at this point, but I think it would at least be viable for a lot of different things, stuff like Slowbro, which is pretty decent. So I think there's merit really to either one, but definitely Swords Dance, Stealth Rock, and Earthquake I think would already be three of the better options. You could potentially as well ditch Stealth Rock and just go with some other rocker like FERROTHORN, and then go for 3 attacks with Dragonium, which I think would actually be another really solid option, since then you still get the Edgewick spam for a lot of other Pokemon like Corviknight and Zapdos, and still get Dragonium for stuff like Como, Slowbro, etc. So I do think that Garchomp would be an incredible Pokemon with Z-move to take a lot of the pressure off of Landorus' more offensive roles. Mega Garchomp could also see a bit of surge in usage just to take advantage of the scale shot sets that would be pretty representative of Landorus' dual dance spreads, but I think that Garchomp with Z would ultimately still be the better option there. For Ferrothorn, this would literally just be standard Ferrothorn. This is just meant to handle Ashgren. I could see it maybe just going for Max Spadef and going with CHOPLE Berry. However, at the same time, I think that leftovers with Ashgren in the format is actually a lot more valuable here. So I think you just kind of have to bank in the LELE gamble, or maybe even just go with Dual Steel with AV Melmetal, or really just throw on some sort of other way to handle LELE, whether it's Sandrill, which is also a lot more viable in that deck than it is, considering it could take advantage of Z. There are a lot of other things you could run as well, maybe like a car. The point being is that there's a lot of other Pokemon that could potentially revenge off LELE in this format, and I think you kind of just need to pick something else, since Ferrothorn would be so essential for Pex. Not for Pex, for Ashgren. The only exception would be, of course, if you were running this in tandem with Pex, which then maybe you could just run Spadef Pex for Ashgren and then run this for LELE. But the point being is that you would be a little bit more pressed to have this choose between LELE and Ashgren because of how good both would be. So speaking of Ashgren though, I know I talked about a lot with Ashgren being pressed by Ferrothorn and Pex. Let's get into Ashgren. Now, I don't actually think Ashgren's primary set would change at all. Ashgren really didn't lose anything that would actually beat it, besides Megalop, which you still Sharken for anyway, which is pretty decent. However, one thing I will say that benefits this is that this is now honestly the best offensive Dark type and the best fast Pokemon in the format, because anything that outpaces Ashgren is a significant amount less viable besides Scarfers. And as far as Pokemon that would specifically be utilized to pressure Ash Greninja, they're still underpaced. For other fast Pokemon, stuff like Koko, slower than Ashgren. If we were to look at other Pokemon such as Kartana, slower than Ashgren without a Scarf. Stuff like Rain Sweepers, such as Barraskewda and Kingdra, slower than Ashgren without Rain. So this really is the premier fast Pokemon in the format now. Really, it's only Scarfers that outpace, and on top of it as well, there's not a better Dark type that would actually be around in the format either. If we're looking at other typically high viability Dark types, the next one after Weavile would literally just be base Greninja, and after that it's Ash Greninja. And I think that Ash Greninja's speed being a leverage over stuff like Koko would actually shoot this higher than Ashgren finally, though I could also see a case for just Protean Z Greninja. Speaking of Z, you do have Z on Ashgren that could still be fairly viable. So there are other ways that this could still pop options, and especially without having to worry about stuff like Heatran, Weavile, or Lando that could all take advantage of Z, albeit Lando's definitely the best of those three by a good amount of Z, but Heatran's still fairly decent with Z move, and Weavile has its merits in some matchups. So I think that Ashgren not having to worry about being on a team with especially like a Landorus or a Heatran that's Z could be really beneficial to Z Ashgren having a little bit less competition for that slot. Albeit though, Specs would still probably be the best set, and I don't really see much of, if anything, for Ashgren's actual usage changing. Finally though, we do have TOXAPEX. Now I think that TOXAPEX enters this list for a few different reasons. For one, it's no longer competing for the best region spot with Torn, and while I will say that it doesn't really matter if Torn is or isn't the best region mon for Pex to be good, it just makes Pex more usable in my personal opinion, because it's no longer having Torn just have a higher usage rate, which truthfully, as I said, the top 5 were just based off what I think will have the most usage, not be the best mons in the format. If it was best mons in the format, LELE would probably be on here. I just think these 5 will be used more is all. So I do think that TOXAPEX would honestly still find its way into teams. As I mentioned, that Ferrothorn, Pex, and GLISCOR I think would be literally the premier balanced defensive core for the entire OU format at this point because of what ended up getting banned. I really don't think that a lot of teams that weren't just strict offense would have a lot of choice in that matter, and I think that Pex would really just need to be here for more of the Ashgren tailoring so Ferrothorn could handle more of the LELE sets. So this would probably be again, standard Pex. It's already EV'd to handle Ashgren. There's no real use in changing this in my personal opinion. So I do think this would probably end up, again, being the most used as far as defensive waters go, and I think it would also be the most used regen Pokemon, because without Torn in the meta, because Torn's just already banned anyway, stuff like Tangrowth, again, isn't really going to be some massively surging Pokemon with a Weavile, Landorus, Heatran ban. There's nothing really besides Garchomp it would surge for, though maybe Garchomp is enough, truthfully. I just don't think it would be enough to shoot Tangrowth into top 5. Otherwise, we would have probably seen that in BDSP OU at this point. And even with stuff like Slowbro, again, I don't think it would shoot in the top 5 with all the electric spam. And while you could make that case for Pex as well, I think the difference being is that Pex is a lot better at handling a fair amount of other top OU Pokemon. Stuff like Kartana, for example, it's neutral against at least, so it's not getting as completely screwed over by stuff like Leaf Blade Kartana. Stuff like Como as well, this would be decent to just haze through instead of Slowbro, which is to do about like 40% with a Psychic and then just get special Dragon move after a Clangor's Soul.
Really a lot of stuff like that, where I think that Pex being able to just haze through stuff or just regen off easier through Z moves because if it's more mixed bulk would be more beneficial. Also, the poison immunity is pretty nice to get rid of opposing toxic spikes. Slowbro would have to run boots in that regard to get rid of toxic spikes or just not be phased by them. So I think that while Slowbro would still be really decent, and it would honestly be a better Garchomp check, on teams where you're running a GLISCOR, I don't think it truthfully matter. If I had to pick a suspect test in this case, I think it'd honestly be Ash, Gren, or Garchomp. I think both would 100% go, though I think everything here besides GLISCOR would actually get one down the road. I don't think a GLISCOR would. I don't even think it'd be a top 5 viable mon. I just think it fills so much of Landorus' roles so splashably, and it does it with pretty much it's a very simple mon, I think, to replace a lot of Landorus' roles that don't require a huge shift in teams, even if it's definitely worse at doing anything that Landorus does besides the defensive sets. So I don't think that GLISCOR would really be some top meta mon, even if everything else here got banned. There'd still be enough offensive counterplay to revenge this, such as Greninja forms, Kyurem, Slowbro, to where I don't think a GLISCOR would ever get banned. I think a Pex might have a case, but really it would only happen, in my personal opinion, if Garchomp went first. But with that said, though, what are your guys' thoughts on how the OU metagames would shift? Did anything in this video surprise you? If it did, let me know in the comments below. And again, make sure you answer next week's comment question. It'll be linked in the description. But if you enjoyed this video and you want to see more content like it, leave a like and subscribe for more. And with that said, shout out to our channel members being Zeke0, Josh, aka Ultra Player, and Mia. Your guys' support is greatly appreciated on the content. And if you want to become a channel member, link to that is also down below, as well as my Twitter and Discord. And with that said, I will see you guys in tomorrow's video. We're going to be taking on the Battle Spot ladder again. Until then, peace out, guys.